Okay, so welcome to the second of three 1-hour sessions this week on scientific writing. I'm Professor Richard Fuller from the University of Queensland. Lovely to see you all again. For those of you who joined us on Monday, thanks for coming back. Those of you who are new today, thank you for showing up today. We have a question over the chat. Great question. Is it possible to get a copy of the recordings? Yes, it absolutely is. And the recordings are up on, the first recording is up on YouTube. Perhaps somebody may be able to find it and put the link in the chat, or otherwise it's on our lab Facebook page, the link to the YouTube recording of the first session. And both of the remaining sessions this week will be recorded and put up onto YouTube as well, and linked on the Facebook page there. So if anybody gets a chance, please do drop that link into the chat so that people can save that link and look at Monday's video separately. Thank you. And thanks already to Tom for placing that link and several others. Thank you into the chat. That's wonderful. Okay, so without further ado, I'll get into today's session. Here's where did we end up? So on Monday, and I hope none of the authors of this paper are aware of that I'm using this example, but anyway, on Monday we looked at this example of writing that's very, very difficult to understand and difficult to extract meaning from. And, you know, we came up with many reasons why. We came up with many suggestions as to what's wrong with writing like this. But of course, the real challenge is, how do we make our own writing better than it currently is? And I work on that every single day, and hopefully we all do, and that's why you're here. Because you're keen to think about and explore those things. So we covered some general ideas around writing, and I implored everybody to, you know, before you write, actually stop and think. That we covered the idea that scientific writing is really a vehicle for transferring what's going on inside your mind to somebody else's mind, and you don't want the writing to get in the way of that. You need to know very clearly what you've discovered. You need to know why it's important, and if you don't know those things, there's no way you can communicate that through your writing to someone else. So if you begin writing something and you suddenly feel uncertain about what it even is that you've discovered or why it's important, then focus on getting that clear inside your head first, or talking with your colleagues and supervisors and really trying to isolate what's new, what's important about your discovery. Once you're confident and clear about that in your head, then you'll be much more, I think, able to write about it in a convincing way to someone else. I should have mentioned, please do put your hand up. There's a hands up function within Zoom. You may need to click on the participant panel to see that. If you'd like to ask a question, please do put your hand up there, and I can have a go at answering questions through that route. You can also use the chat if you prefer, but I'll find that slightly more difficult to keep referring to as I'm talking. Okay. Second, again, last time we thought about this, write to be understood, not to impress, and a few kind of ideas around here about avoiding complexity. Don't try to use long words instead of short words just to impress people. You know, focus on simple, clear phraseology. Okay, so we ended up just about here at the end of Monday's session, and this, I think, is one of the most, this is the way I learned to write. What's on this slide is how I learned what I currently know about scientific writing, and I'm by far from the best scientific writer. I'm still learning every day and learning from those around me. And I think that is the most important message, perhaps even of these 3 sessions. Learn from edits to your work. As you're writing, of course, you'll find the hardest part is the first part. You have a blank page, you have a cursor blinking at you, threatening you from the screen. You know, the hardest bit for sure is beginning to write something. But once you, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but once you have something on the page, you then need to share that with other people. And psychologically, that can be challenging. I used to struggle a lot with that. I used to think, I can't possibly show somebody else this piece of writing. You know, it's not good enough. It's not perfect. In fact, you know, I don't feel confident that this writing is very good. So therefore, I'm reluctant to share it with other people. I think it's worth trying to get over that reluctance. Share it with other people. If you don't want to send it to your supervisor just yet, perhaps your supervisor is short of time and maybe they prefer things to be better developed, or send it to a fellow PhD student or another master's student or somebody around you. Agree with, you know, make an agreement with some of your colleagues that you'll send each other your work, and, you know, and you'll read each other's work, and hopefully not just read it and give comments, but actually provide edits. I find when people edit the work that I've done, I find that one of the best ways of working out how to improve a piece of writing. And this is how I really learned to write. I would construct drafts of what I wanted to write. I would send it to my supervisor, and my supervisor would edit the text. They wouldn't just provide generalized comments, they would actually edit the text. And I wouldn't just get it back, accept all the edits and carry on. I think the critical thing is to look at every single edit and try to understand how that edit and why that edit has improved a sentence. That, I think, is really, really key. Because it's one thing to read a great scientific paper and say, right, well, I need to emulate that brilliant piece of writing. That's good, and it's important to do that. And I note, for those, you have a look in the chat, for those at the University of Queensland, a journal club has been set up, and that will be one of the aims of that club, is to do that kind of activity, and it's very important. But I think it's a whole other thing to start with your own writing and then say, how do I make it better? And that's really how the writing process goes. You begin with a first draft, and then you've got to make it better and better over time. So send it to trusted co-authors, supervisors. Make sure those people are using track changes. Or if they don't, use document compare within Microsoft Word, if that's what you're using. What that does is it compares 2 versions of a document and marks any of the changes just like they are track changes. So if you get a version back from somebody and it doesn't have track changes, run it through the document compare. That will then identify all the places where that person has edited your work. Have a look at every single edit. Depending on who you sent it to, most or all of the edits could be improvements on what you've already got. And you can really learn from that. Take them apart. Again, analyze each edit. Have they deleted some words? Have they changed one word for another? Have they suggested a restructuring of a sentence? Have they suggested moving one paragraph to a different place? You know, what are all the edits, and why is each edit better than what you had before? You know, does it read better? Does it just feel more beautiful? Does it say it more simply? Does it have the same meaning but fewer words? These are all things that we're trying to achieve with our scientific writing, remember? a high density of meaning, but in highly readable and simple text. If the edit gets you towards that, then accept the edit and try to learn from that edit. If you think actually the edit doesn't make it better, maybe sometimes an edit makes a piece of text worse, and of course then you may wish to reject that edit. So I'm not saying uncritically accept all the edits, but I am saying try to learn from them. And even if you think an edit has made your text worse, it's worth making sure you kind of explicitly think about why that is. Why is that worse than what I had? And, you know, should I reject that edit on that basis? So I think this is really important, learning from edits and that others do to your piece of work. Now, let's assume that you're facing the blank screen, you're trying to construct text for a piece of writing that you're trying to make. What are some of the overall goals that you're aiming for? And what's on this slide here, I think, is actually one of the commonest reasons why scientific writing doesn't work. And it can be quite a hard problem to diagnose. Is your story told logically and in a clearly flowing way, with each sentence building on the previous one? You don't want your writing to be collections of random facts that are about the topic at hand. You need to be telling a logical story. And you need to carry the reader along. I've enthusiastically written there, carry them along on a wave of joy, but that's to remind us that, you know, we need to care about the reader, and we need to go easy on the reader, make it easy for them to engage with the writing that we've done. So make each sentence build on and continue from the previous one, make each sentence easy to read, make each sentence bring in, you know, a new thought, but do that in a stepwise way, not just great big avalanches of information, but a building story through the text. That especially applies to introductions, but also discussions, and really also methods and results sections in a way. I mean, they all need to be layered, and you need to think about the sort of flow of the material. And if you're building something and it's just not working, try it again. Try it in a different way. And I think importantly, you may have spent, I don't know, weeks, days or weeks trying to craft an introduction, for example. And maybe you end up deciding it's just not working. I can't get it to work in this way. That's okay. You can change it. And I think it's important to be open to changing what you've written. It can be incredibly frustrating, of course, and, you know, deeply upsetting in a way if you spent ages crafting something and you just think, well, I'm not going to change this or delete it because I'm too attached to it. I think it's important not to become too attached to it and to be open to having another go in a slightly different way. Maybe you can reuse some of what you've written, but maybe sometimes you need to start again. I've done that more than once. Just completely delete the whole thing and start again, and try to come at it in a different way. Now, I found that some people, we all vary in how organised our mind is. I have quite a disorganised mind. Some people have a very organised mind and work very well by trying to flesh out each paragraph or even each sentence and bullet point out what each paragraph or sentence might look like, and then think about the logic in that way, and then begin filling in each sentence or paragraph. And if that works for you, that's great. I think there's no single recipe for the technical side of how to construct logically flowing writing. So if that works for you, then do it. You know, write down the ideas and then fill in the sentences and paragraphs. For me, I tend to write in quite a linear way and just sort of begin writing and get to a point, and I think suddenly I might think this isn't working well and I need to go back and go at it again. But that's just me. We all work in different ways, but we're all trying for the same outcome, which is this clearly logical developing flow. Okay. No hands up yet. Do feel free to ask questions as we go along, should you wish to. So let's get into the structure of a scientific paper. The next tranche of material in these presentations, I'm going to basically go through the typical structure for a scientific paper and just talk about some of the issues around preparing each of these different components of scientific papers. Of course, different disciplines work in different ways, and also different papers work in different ways. A review paper, for example, may not have sections that look much like this at all. Or if you're writing a commentary for Nature, it's not going to look like this. But for the majority of papers that we write on a day-to-day basis, this is the kind of structure that they have. So we'll have a look through this sort of, we'll use this structure to guide the next part of these sessions. First of all, the title. Now, very often I see titles appearing very late in the preparation of manuscripts. And for me, a title is almost a starting point, almost, or at least something that happens quite early in the preparation of a manuscript. To me, the title almost embodies your thinking. You know, remember we spoke about that the first step in all of this is to get your thinking clear. What have you discovered? And really the title should be a very short, concise description of what you discovered, right? So I think really almost from the beginning, perhaps not quite from the beginning, but near the beginning of drafting a paper, you should have a very clear idea of exactly what the central discovery of that piece of work is, and the aspect of that you want to really highlight the most. So I think the title should be becoming pretty clear fairly quickly. And if you can't think of a title for your paper, ask yourself whether, does that mean you haven't quite been able to crystallize in your mind what your most important findings are. So perhaps at the beginning, you know, have a think about what a title might be. Of course, it might change as you go through the paper. Titles normally go through a number of iterations, but having a clear title is a good way of reminding yourself as you're drafting a paper what the thing's actually about. Sometimes we lose track of that as we're building papers. You know, what am I trying to do again? Am I going off on a side tangent when actually I should be heading straight for this thing that's in my title of my paper? Titles are also very important. They're often the first thing that readers will see of your paper, and all too often they'll be the last thing that a reader sees. And if the title is hard to understand or not very compelling, then a potential reader may not become a reader of your paper. So titles are hugely important, I think, in capturing attention and in convincing somebody that your paper might be worth them investing some of their time. And the more interesting a title is, then the more memorable, the more chance there is of a person picking up your paper and reading it. So first and foremost, I think a title should grab attention. And here's some examples of titles that I've taken out of some conservation journals. And again, apologies to anyone who may have written some of these titles. Titles can be very wordy. Sometimes I find when titles are, this is my personal opinion, other people may have different opinions. I find when titles are very long and very wordy, I kind of find it hard to know as a reader what I might focus on. What might be in it for me? What are the main themes that are really being talked about? And when they're so wordy and you're going through maybe journal, table of contents or something, you kind of have to work to pick apart very long, wordy titles. So you may want to think about, perhaps you've drafted a title that's quite long. Think about whether you could cut that down to a more, to the heart of it. What's the paper really about? Can you express that in more general terms? The more you qualify and restrict, the more adjectives that you have in your title, the more you're narrowing it down, right? And you're saying, this paper is specialist. It's about the intensity of land use. It's about wild bees. It's about tropical landscapes. It's about the southeast of a particular country, right? And you can start to narrow down your paper. Whereas what you want to do is to try and reach, I think, as general an audience as you can with your paper. What are the big themes that your paper's tackling? And why might, say, a landscape ecologist in Papua New Guinea be interested in this? So as far as you can, I think try to be as general as possible. Sometimes words are very long. Do we always need things like scientific names? Do we really need to faithfully represent every detail of a study in the title? I think the title, doesn't need to capture all of the details of the paper itself. And another common problem with titles, the third title here is one example of that, and is that maybe they can be quite non-specific. Like, I don't know the answer to the question. I know the paper assessed the effects of non-native crayfish on mosquito survival, but I don't know sort of what the answer was. And you might say, well, if you want to know the answer, read the paper. But of course, our time is limited and the time of your readers is limited. Perhaps if your title said, non-native crayfish kill almost, cause 99% mortality of mosquitoes, or something that actually tells you the headline and tells you the core result, then as a reader, you might even just remember that title, and that may be enough to make you remember that paper and then look that paper up when it comes to a point of you writing an introduction and then citing that paper. A title like this doesn't really tell you what the finding was, and you may sort of forget that title for later. So I think better titles are brief, are relatively general in their scope, and maybe tell you something about what the paper actually discovered. Now, not all of these titles do all of those things, but I think these sorts of titles are better because they're more general. They touch on bigger issues. They don't go into precise details. So, for example, the third paper down there doesn't talk in great length about the scientific names of fungal diseases of amphibians. It's a living with the enemy. It's kind of got a catchy first part of the title, that's something you might remember. You know, you're a specialist in this field. You know, you'll know having memorable parts to titles like that may enable you to remember that paper and then to cite that paper at a later date, and may encourage you to read it. You think, well, they've kind of been a bit imaginative with their title. Therefore, you know, that paper might be an interesting read and not a very dense and difficult paper to read, right? So the title is communicating something about the style of the paper as well as the content of the paper itself. Same goes, I think, for the top title there. It doesn't tell you exactly what the paper found, but it does suggest that the writing in the paper is going to be simple. It's going to take, you know, it's going to tell you a story, and it's not going to be too kind of difficult and dense and hard to read. So I think titles can signal important things about papers. Someone's asked a really interesting question in the chat, privately to me, but a really great question. Is there a risk of a paper not appearing in search terms if they're this brief? And that's a really good point. I would argue 2 points on this. I would argue it makes it more likely to come up in search terms, because I think this first one is a very good example. Look at the words they use in that title. They are some of the most general words that you could possibly use in the discipline of conservation biology. Protected areas, biodiversity, conservation. In that case, they've mentioned a country, India. Now, anybody conducting any kind of general, that's going to appear on a lot of searches, right? People who are searching for anything to do with conservation or biodiversity or protected areas, that paper is going to come up. So it's going to come up on a lot of different searches. But I think what the question is getting at is, well, there may be other detail in here that, you know, is not mentioned in the title, therefore it may get missed. Well, there are other places, of course, that you can put that detail in. You can make sure that detail goes into your list of keywords that go along with the paper. You know, that will ensure it comes up in most searches that people do. You can also make sure that your abstract covers off on all of those aspects of the paper that you want to get across to readers. Often, you know, a title like that may get somebody to read an abstract, and then in the abstract you can cover off on some of those details that you want, extra details you want people to know. Judy's raised her hand. Judy, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, actually type it in the chat room. It's just my research is relatively localized, and I'm not sure if a brief title would make it feel like it looks big, but what I did is actually very small.
That's a brilliant question, and there is a risk of that. There is a risk of that. I get accused of that a lot by journal editors.
Okay.
And quite often I have to tone down some of my titles. I think my advice is don't take it too far, right? It's got to reflect, the title needs to reflect the paper and not kind of imply or promise something that is more general than what the paper actually delivers. But at the same time, you want to sort of grab attention. So, you know, there really is a balance to strike between those two things. I don't know how openly I should admit this, but often what I do, I hope there's no journal editors listening to this, but often what I do is initially write a title of a paper that is quite, you know, that pushes the limit, that tries to emphasize the generality and the general interest of a piece of work. not in a misleading way, but in a way that really maximizes that generalizability, on the basis that that may make the difference between an editor noticing that piece of work and rejecting it straight away, right? And I think this particularly applies to the highest impact journals. You know, you really want to push as far as you can, but not too far, the generalizability and the importance, the general importance of what you've done. It is a fine line. I fully take that. And then sometimes what happens is during a review process, the reviewer might say, you know, that title's really kind of a bit over the top. And then it can be brought back a little bit during the review process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Jez asks on the chat that wordplay. So this last this last title here is kind of wordplay, really, and there are other examples of much more complicated playing with words. The question is, you know, is that a barrier to people who do not have English as their first language? And I think that's a really important point. I think we should be careful and we should be cognizant of the fact that, you know, probably the majority of scientists in the world do not have English as their first language. And it may be at best confusing and at worst utterly misleading to have complicated wordplay in titles. So all I can suggest, I think, is that's something we should be thinking about. Okay. And later on in this, hopefully on Friday, and if not in the future, I would really like to open up some discussion amongst people, particularly people who don't have English as their first language. And hopefully Friday we'll have the chance to do that. Otherwise, I want to do that in future. There's rather too many on the session at the moment to kind of really have a good discussion, which is why I'm a talking head. Okay. Are you still, my internet just, hold on a sec. Can somebody let me know if you can still hear me well? On the chat, perhaps?
I can.
Yeah. Okay, all right, thank you very much. Thank you. I shall. Go again. I'm just finding my screen share again. Here we go. Okay. So we're still on titles, more examples of brief and hopefully compelling titles. These are some titles that I enjoyed from the literature. I don't know if we need to go through each of these, but very brief titles and I think relatively compelling. Covered this already, really. General words, I think, are better than specific words. This is a paper I was involved with as a co-author a number of years ago. And at that point in time, this was a paper about urban ecology. And it was a relatively new kind of newish discipline at the time. And we went for a very general title for that paper. And, you know, and subsequently that paper was cited much more than we expected. And part of me wondered about whether the title had something to do with it. Another kind of title is a headline title, where you, instead of focusing your title around a topic or the topic of your paper, you use a headline style. And in fact, this can be a very useful exercise when you're writing a paper, even if you don't use it for a title, ask yourself, what would the newspaper headline be for my paper? If I had to write a newspaper headline, what words would I use? What discovery would I focus on? And that has, I think, two potential benefits for your writing. The first one is it gives you a very clear statement of the heart of what your paper is about and what your discovery is about. And I think once you get a useful headline for your paper, I encourage you to write it out and stick it on your desk and, you know, stick it up on your wall. And, you know, that's what my paper's about. I'm going to write everything around showing, you know, leading up to that headline point. And the other use, of course, for this is as a title for your paper. Some papers lend themselves quite well to headlines like this. And the beauty of a title like this is that somebody can basically understand the paper without reading it, more or less. And this can, in some circumstances, make a paper very memorable and kind of tell people all they need to know at that point in time when they're looking through the literature, and then they may be able to come back to that paper when they need it for an introduction or to cite it and so on. So headlines are very useful. I encourage you to think of headlines. Maybe your paper has 2 or 3 headlines, in which case you may want a general title that covers all of those headlines. Maybe you have a shorter paper that has one clear central finding, and a title like this might help you communicate that finding clearly. Okay. Any more questions on titles before we move on? Or hopefully I'm not missing anything in the chat. You all seem happy. Okay. Let's move on. Abstract. Again, very important. I think it's the next most important thing in a paper after the title. An abstract is like an overture. And in other words, it has a little bit of everything. It kind of captures the entire paper in a very short form. And so often abstracts are badly written, so often. It's a really common error, I think, and it's actually a very serious error. Even if your paper is published and it has a bad abstract, I think that can really reduce the utility of your paper and the rate of citation of your paper. So I please implore you, write a good abstract, spend time on it. Don't just rush it together on the day before submission. I mentioned when we talked about titles that I often begin with a title very early in the paper writing process. And often if I begin with the title, the next thing is the abstract. And in fact, writing the abstract is a really good way, especially for people who don't really write in a very organized way like me. An abstract is a very good way of deciding on the structure of your arguments and the content of your paper. In your abstract, you're going to need, 2 or 3 sentences to introduce the topic. So you're going to need to pick those sentences pretty carefully, and you're going to need to choose the very best points of logic to tell the reader, what your study is about and where the research gap is. So giving some clear background and then clearly specifying what the gap is. What is it we don't know that we need to know? And the 2 or 3 sentences that you choose in the abstract, it could be really, that can really help you decide on what the macro structure of the introduction should look like. so often I think I see papers written the other way round, where someone hammers away for ages on an introduction, and it's quite difficult to reorganize and restructure something like an introduction. Whereas an abstract, you can very quickly play around with it and really try to get the right logic into the abstract. So again, if you're struggling with, at any point in a paper, you're struggling, you're thinking, I don't know if I've even got the logic right, have a go at writing the abstract for it, and see if you can really clean up that logic and make it work. It sounds obvious and silly that I would even say that an abstract should include all of these things, but you know, I encourage you maybe in your journal clubs to take a look at some abstracts and see how many of them really cover the whole thing. How many of them are a complete overture that cover all aspects of the paper? Often important things are missed out. Surprisingly often I see abstracts without results in them, and you finish the abstract and you're not actually quite sure what the key results were of the paper. Sometimes the abstract spends a lot of time on the background and the gap, and that's kind of weird. An abstract must cover all of these things. It must say what the result was. It must say why that result is important. And of course, all of this can be done in relatively few sentences, and needs to be done in relatively few sentences. So you really have to come up with the very best logic and the best stuff. A question on the chat there: does this kind of abstract structure apply to an honours thesis too? I couldn't answer a question like that. Well, for the University of Queensland it does, and in my school it does. But one has to be very careful of making sure you're complying with whatever instructions are given for particular courses, right? So that's always very important. I guess my presentations here are really focused around the scientific paper. If you're involved in student courses and so on, you must check, of course, with course coordinators and so on around what's required for particular courses. But I would argue, as a general principle, any abstract really should cover all of these things. In some cases, for some theses or courses, you may need more extended abstracts. PhD theses, for example, tend to have quite extended abstracts that cover more, but that's mainly because the document is bigger. I mean, the basic logic of the abstract is still essentially the same. And someone asked about posters. Is it different for posters? That's a great question. I feel like I'd want to talk about posters at a little bit greater length. I might come back to that question about posters. I have a few views on posters that I'd like to share. I'll do that separately, so please remind me about that if I don't come back to it before Friday. Okay. Any more questions on abstracts? All right. Well, we're going to cover some more detail in abstracts, and again, here's another one of these not so well kept secrets. Nature tell us what abstracts should look like. And if you look at the author, this is from a few years ago, maybe slightly different now, but it's going to be broadly the same. If you look at the author guidelines for the journal Nature, you'll see they're very prescriptive about their bold paragraph, their so-called bold paragraph, which comes at the front of Nature papers. Now, bold paragraphs they're not quite abstracts. They're not quite. They differ subtly from abstracts. But I find this kind of structure incredibly useful for crafting abstracts, even for papers that are not destined for nature. And let's face it, almost all of our papers are not destined for nature. But what nature have very helpfully done is analysed and pulled apart the abstract and said, here's what it should be. It should have 1 or 2 sentences with a basic introduction, a few more sentences that go into a bit more detail, a sentence clearly stating the general problem, or in other words, the research gap. You see here, the authors have written, however, the precise roles of kinesin 5 during this process are unknown. That clearly signals to the reader what we don't know, and therefore implicitly, or really explicitly, what the paper is trying to do and what the paper is going to show. Then the famous "here we show" sentence. What is the result? What did you find? What did you show? We don't want 16 sentences of methods in the abstract. You may need to have 1 or 2 sentences that specify some of the methods, but really, do you really need? So you don't need much detail about methods in many abstracts. Of course, there'll always be exceptions. Sometimes you can make the methods and results kind of intermingle with each other. And you can see that in this example here. There's some discussion about methods we found in controlled in vitro assays, giving you some idea of the methods, but focusing really on what was actually discovered. And then here in that magenta color, 2 or 3 sentences explaining what the results are and what the results reveal. Then, towards the end of that bold paragraph, 1 or 2 sentences that then begin to put those results in a more general context. You know, when you view all of your results together in this paper, what does it all mean? What does it demonstrate? What does it exhibit? What does it show? What questions does it raise? And then finally, you know, back to the broader perspective. What does it mean for the future? Is something now different? Or, you know, does it raise further questions, or does it now enable us to do something that we couldn't do before? So, you know, if there's another exercise I would recommend when you're writing a paper, you know, trying to write a nature style bold paragraph for your paper could be another good way of building the logic and building what is essentially a very first draft, right? In some ways, this could be a first draft of your paper. And somebody else, if you like, has done the hard work and kind of suggested what the structure might be. And what these author guidelines are doing is giving us a clear signal about the logic of a paper. And whatever journal you're aiming for, whatever, you know, whether it's you're writing your honours thesis or you're preparing a paper for Nature, it doesn't matter. The same logic applies. You've got to have background. You've got to specify a research gap. You've got to say what you did. You've got to say what the results were and what they mean and why they're important, and how the world is now different as a result of the paper that you've written. So this could be another useful exercise if you're struggling with your paper, but it could be a useful exercise anyway at the beginning of any paper that you write. And I just wanted to give a real example. Here's a paper that we published in Nature earlier this year, and the bold paragraph that we wrote for this paper, and just a very quick tour through the bold paragraph and the way that one can use some of the structure that Nature impose upon us, you know, to help us craft papers and to help us craft the logic. So we began this bold paragraph with some general kind of big statements about the big problem that's out there. Big stuff. We weren't talking detail. In this paper, what we did in this paper was map tidal flats globally. That's what we did. We used remote sensing to build the first maps of tidal flats, intertidal ecosystems globally. That was it. But the first sentence of the bold paragraph talks about big issues around coastal ecosystems. We then zoomed in a bit and talked about some of the more specific threats to some of those ecosystems. We then started to highlight what the gap is, what the problem is. There's something that's holding us back. We can't fully assess coastal ecosystems because one of the major parts of those ecosystems has never been mapped. We don't know where it is. We don't know how it's changing over time. We didn't use here we show, we used here we present, but any sentence like this kind of very clear statement of the discovery that's at the heart of a paper comes quick. We talked here about methods. We wanted to emphasize the scale of the methods that went into this, and straight into discovery, showing that tidal flats cover the amount of area that they cover. Some sentences that develop the results a little bit further. You know, by this point, the reader is kind of brought along with the logic of all of this and ready for some more detailed information about, you know, perhaps where tidal flats are. Then some information about the trends and the changes in tidal flats that had been observed over time, and estimating that 16% of these things have been lost globally. Now again, beginning to zoom out, talking about the sort of threats to coastal ecosystems, you know, emphasizing this forms part of a generalized negative trajectory for ecosystems and tidal flats in particular around the world. And then finally, kind of talking about, I suppose, you know, how this paper's changed things. It's provided the first global maps of this particular ecosystem and so on. And again, I don't misunderstand me. I'm not presenting this to try to brag in any way. I'm using it as an example of, you know, providing a way of a useful, structured way of breaking up a paper and talking through the logic of a paper. And I found, you know, I find writing abstracts and bold paragraphs a really useful exercise. So, this is almost like I planned the timing. If there is some homework, you certainly don't need to submit it to me. In fact, you don't even have to do it. But I would suggest writing a nature style bold paragraph for whatever your next paper or thesis chapter is. You know, even if you don't send it to Nature, not all papers, of course, are going to end up there. But I find the impeccable logic behind what the Nature editors have shared with us to be very useful. Okay. I think I'm going to stop soon. Would anybody like to raise any questions or discussion points from what we've covered today? Great, someone has to write their abstract soon, so that's excellent. Hope this has come at a useful time for you. One question is, should abstracts normally have in-text citations or references? My answer to that is, it depends. It depends on the journal, first of all. In the case of Nature bold paragraphs, they all have citations in them. You know, they're numbered citations, so they're not too disturbing, but they're in there. And the reason for that is, in Nature bold paragraphs, they're not quite abstracts in the normal sense. the bold paragraph in Nature is actually the first paragraph of the paper. Nature papers don't actually have an abstract in the true sense. What that means is that the next part, the opening part of the paper after the bold paragraph, cannot repeat things that were in the bold paragraph. And that is a difference to a traditional abstract. So the first answer is, it depends on the journal. If you're writing for Nature, you need to have citations in the bold paragraph. There are some journals where references in the abstracts are a normal part of that journal. In general, I would advise against it. I don't think it's very helpful. I think the abstract is an overture. It's a summary of the paper. The referencing and the detail is in the paper itself. So you may feel slightly wrong if you're writing some background in an abstract sentence and then not providing a reference sourcing that information. But you shouldn't feel that's wrong, because you're providing those references in the abstract of the paper, in the introduction and in the text of the paper itself. So general rule, don't include citations or references in an abstract. Do include them when the journal explicitly calls for it, such as Nature. And there's some very rare occasions where you may need to include them. For example, if you're replying to or critiquing a particular paper, you may need to cite that paper in the abstract so you can be clear what you're talking about. A very interesting and useful question: is it a good idea to include geographic location in a title? You know, it seems that really that all that's going to do is reduce the generalizability of a title. I don't think there's a single answer to that. I think it depends on the paper at hand. I would discourage you from using very specific geographic references. Broad ones, continental and maybe national geographic references may be useful, but very, very specific geographic references may not be especially useful. For example, you know, the name of a protected area, for example, or a national park. There may be one or two cases where that's useful, but by and large, you know, that's only going to serve to reduce your generalizability. So when would you ever include geographic references? Well, I think it comes back to the issue we talked about earlier, about honesty, about the limits to the generalizability of your work. If you're studying a particular system that has a geographic limit to it, then I think it's honest and worth talking about that, and you may want to reflect that in a title so that you don't over generalize. It's a balance, and my answer is incomplete and not desperately helpful. Useful question about going back to the issue around co-authors and editing and so on. How to deal with co-authors who are editing each other's edits. You know, especially when you have co-authors who are all experienced. Who do you believe? How do you manage what may be a conflict between what different people think about the course of a manuscript? Very important question, and I have a section in the rest of this presentation which covers that issue exactly, so I'll be dealing with that next time. That requires a few minutes to talk about. Okay, I think things are slowing down, so thank you very much, and I'm going to end the session in a moment. So thank you all for joining us today on this second of 3 sessions, and we shall have another go on Friday. Thank you for all your thanks, that's lovely and very nice to see, and hopefully catch you all again on Friday at 12 o'clock Brisbane time. So thank you for joining us, and I will end the meeting right here. Thank you all.